Hi, everybody, and welcome to Exegetically Speaking, a podcast of the friends and faculty of Wheaton College, Wheaton, Illinois, and the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas. My name is David Capes, and I am the Senior Research Fellow at the Lanier Theological Library and a former dean up there in Wheaton at the School of Biblical and Theological Studies. Our purpose in these podcasts is really very simple. We want to promote the study of biblical languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, so we can read the Bible more faithfully, study it more fully, and not just read it, but to live it. Joining me today on Exegetically Speaking is Dr. Sandra Richter. She has a PhD from Harvard University and teaches in a very prestigious place and wonderful and beautiful place out on the West Coast. She is the Robert H. Gundry Chair of Biblical Studies at Westmont College and is the author of a book that I'm going to be talking about on another podcast called The Stewards of Eden, What Scripture Says About the Environment and Why It Matters. That'll be on the Stone Chapel podcast. Sandy, great to see you, and welcome to the podcast.
It is so great to be here, David. Thank you so much for the invitation.
So how did you get started reading Hebrew? I mean, you're an Old Testament specialist. How did you get started reading Hebrew?
Oh, almost by mistake. I was already in ministry and had realized pretty quick that I needed some extra training. So I started commuting over from Western Mass to the esteemed Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and dropped into a Hebrew class with the inimitable Gary Pratico, and it just goes from there. So that's how I started.
So my sense is you probably use it on a regular basis, right? Both in your research and in your preaching, teaching, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I tell my students this and they don't believe me until they get through intermediate. You know, it takes about those 3 semesters before it really penetrates. But if I didn't know Hebrew, I would feel like I was blind trying to read the text. Whenever I'm reading the text in whatever language it's being presented to me in, I've got another wheel running in the back of my mind about the Hebrew. Language is such a window into culture, into posture. Yeah. How can you understand a people group without knowing something about their language?
Right. Exactly. And that's part of what we're trying to do here on Exegetically Speaking is sort of introduce people to some of those insights. Let's look at one that we're going to talk about today. I don't usually do this, but I'm going to read kind of a long section from Deuteronomy chapter 22 and ask you to comment on it because you've got some thoughts and insights, and actually you're going to be maybe making a suggestion to the NIV committee here soon in 2021 summer about maybe changing some things. So I'm reading from the NIV translation, which is a great translation, but here's the text, and I really want your thoughts and comments on it. But if out in the country a man happens to meet a girl pledged to be married and rapes her, only the man who has done this shall die. Do nothing to the girl. She has committed no sin deserving death. The case is like that of someone who attacks and murders his neighbor. For the man found the girl out in the country, and though the betrothed girl screamed, there was no one to rescue her. If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay the girl's father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the girl, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. Now tell us about that text. I mean, that text full of violence, full of, rape.
Yeah.
What are we seeing?
Yeah.
What are we not seeing?
Well, I have an article coming out on this in the Journal of Evangelical Theology. We're in the final proofs. I have a proposal into the NIV, as you mentioned as well. Okay, so let's do the context thing, right? So first of all, what is the book of Deuteronomy? It's a law code. And the book as a whole really is the constitution and bylaws of ancient Israel, the theocratic nation under the Davidic monarchy. Okay, so it's a law code, and that's why it's engaging rules of sexual misconduct. So narrowing it a little bit, chapter 22 has to do largely with issues of sexual misconduct. It might be a little surprise to your listeners, but sexual misconduct is as old as hills. And so these ancient law codes are addressing it as well. This larger pericope, this larger paragraph is questions of who has committed a crime against who was participating and who wasn't participating, and like even current cases of rape in the courts, what the author ultimately is after is the question of consent. The passage that you've read, it actually launches just a little bit earlier with, okay, what if a guy finds a girl who is engaged in the city and he has sex with her? Who's guilty? And the answer is going to be they're both guilty, because in the city, if she had resisted at all, these people live in very dense situations. Somebody would have heard her and would have been able to help. So obviously she didn't resist.
She didn't scream, basically.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. Right. So the rabbis will pick up on that and expand the idea of resistance. But the essential issue in verse 23 is she didn't resist. So this was consensual. When we get to verse 25, but if in a field the man finds her, she's innocent, because the assumption, and I love this, especially compared to the American court system, the assumption is that she resisted. And it goes on to say that the crime that he's committed is not a crime of sexual passion. Rather, as you look at verse 26, you shall do nothing to the girl. There is no sin in the girl worthy of death. For just as a man rises against his neighbor and murders him, so is this case. Okay, so the law code in Deuteronomy, dating to about 1200 BC, figured out about, 3,000 years before we did, is not a crime of sexual passion. It's a crime of violence, to be compared to murder. So the girl is completely cleared of any misconduct. Her reputation should not be damaged, but you execute him. So far we're feeling pretty good about Deuteronomy, right?
Right.
Then we get to verse 29. And as you've read it in the NIV, verse 28 reads, if a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged, so she's not betrothed, there's no man involved, right? And he rapes her and they're discovered, well, then he's got to pay the bride price and she's got to marry him. And so every 22-year-old girl out there who's listening to this podcast is, what?
Yeah.
A guy rapes me and I have to marry him? And he essentially buys my father off? What kind of God is this that you serve? So this is where exegesis can be so incredibly helpful. If we stay just with this passage, and if we can read Hebrew, we see that there's a very important verb shift here. And the verb shift is back there in verse 23 and 24. The man who is finding the girl who is engaged, verse 25, the man forces her and lies with her. The verb is chazak, which is a verb that always involves force, seizing, grasping. And if we take this verb to the story of the rape of Tamar, we see that the verb chazak shows up again. If we look at the rape of the concubine at the end of the book of Judges, chazak shows up again. Now, literally, it means to seize. It doesn't mean to rape. Hebrew doesn't have a verb for to rape. We'll see in a moment that Akkadian does. So chazak communicates clearly force. When we get down to verse 28 and 29, we see that the verb shifts. It's not chazak anymore. Now it's tafas, which can mean to take in hand, but a musician takes an instrument in hand. Traveling takes his luggage in hand. An officer of the court can take someone who is accused in hand to bring them to the elders. Right. So within the passage itself, we should be pulled up a little bit like, okay, why is our author shifting verbs? So we need to ask that question. Then the next thing we can do exegetically is we can say, okay, Deuteronomy is one of three law codes in our biblical text. We also have the Levitical law code, and we have that's called the covenant code, which is that first expression of the covenant that's given to Moses on Mount Sinai.
It's back in Exodus, right?
So if we flip back to Exodus chapter 22, we find ourselves a parallel law, which isn't unusual. Law codes often have parallel laws. And in this parallel, I'll read it to you. If a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and lies with her, he must pay a dowry, a bride price, for her to be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the dowry for virgins. Okay, so the whole business about bride price and dowry, we don't have time to address that all today, and that is very foreign in our community. But in theirs, it was an act of respect to the father of the bride. Any respectable marriage is going to involve a gift of the bride. And if you hang out in Kenya, it still is. But so this parallel law clearly communicates, the verb here is patah, that what's going on is a seduction, not a rape. So our passage in Deuteronomy, the verb is shifted. This should make us ask questions. When we move outside our law code to another law code, we see, in Exodus, it's clearly a seduction, not a rape. And if we move outside to the Middle Assyrian law code, the law code of Hammurabi, et cetera, we're going to find all sorts of other interesting things. So the argument that I would make about Deuteronomy 22, 28, and 29 is that it's been mistranslated in the NIV. And it's communicating a violent act, and it shouldn't be. And so I actually have a proposal into this year's NIV committee to get that straightened out.
So how would you suggest that we read that rather than rape? Just seduction?
Yeah, it should be seduction. So if a man happens to meet a virgin who's not pledged to be married and he seduces her, and look at the following passage, and they are discovered. Okay, this is the standard language of an adulterous pair. This is a consensual act, and they're discovered. Then what are we going to do? Granted, by our current law codes, she might have been manipulated, she might have been influenced, she might be underage. And all of those things would still draw attention in our law codes. What's not happening here is an act of violence. And also, just to fill in a little bit of the background, in the ancient world, as it still is in most traditional societies, becoming a wife and a mother was a career path. This was not something you did on the side while you're busy becoming the CEO of Apple, okay?
Yes.
This was a career path. You trained for it. The selection process was very similar to figuring out which law school you were going to go to so you could determine which firm you would become a partner in. Alliances between families, resources were exchanged. This was a very important and very careful process on the part of both families. So Gordon Hugenberger, you might remember his name, and he was one of my professors in seminary. He actually wrote his dissertation on marriage as a covenant. And he thinks, as do many other scholars who specialize in this, that this is the loophole, this particular law, for when two powerful families had pledged their children to each other in order to ally their families. You know, think royalty in Europe.
Yeah, exactly.
And this young man and this young woman didn't necessarily love each other. And so how is the fiddler on the roof's daughter going to get permission to marry her tailor? And according to Hugenberger, the way that this love match works around the system is they sneak off to a vineyard somewhere and they do the deed. And once they do, both families are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
And how do these families now move forward?
Mm-hmm. And the other side of this is that just like today, there were plenty of young men out there who were willing to take advantage of a young, innocent girl. Now, to quote Taylor Swift, instead of Fiddler on the Roof, if you're 15 and someone tells you they love you, you're going to believe them, right? This young man has taken advantage of this girl's innocence. He can walk away, except for this law. And She, of course, as a 15-year-old who's been compromised, has shamed her entire family. She has compromised her marriageability. The gift that should be offered to her family has just evaporated. And she might never be able to pursue that career path of marriage and family. So this is also what I call in my article, the law against the walkaway Joe. In this case, what he thought was going to be an uncomplicated affair, he's just found himself a wife. And the next verse reads, he can never divorce her as long as he lives.
He cannot write her a certificate of divorce and say, I'm done.
Nope.
Wow. Fascinating stuff. I love this. Thanks for your contribution today, and thanks for helping us think deeply, both in the text, but also in the broader culture. Dr. Sandra Richter, thanks so much.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks to Silvio Vasquez, Rebecca Larson, and Krista Sanchez for helping us to produce this podcast. Thanks as well to Phil Keggy for our music. If you want to study biblical languages, the best place you could do that is Wheaton College. They have an amazing program, one of the best I've ever seen, whether you want to be a graduate or an undergraduate student. So go to the website, www.wheaton.edu, and look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Contact us at exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. That's exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Thanks for listening.